Escape dominated headlines, leaving a nation on edge. News outlets speculated about the brazen methods used to flee a maximum service prison, marveling at the audacity of the act. Authorities scrambled to track Damien Cross, their warnings stark. Do not approach. He is considered extremely dangerous. Behind the stark announcements lingered an unspoken question. How could such a calculated plan succeed in one of the country's most secure facilities? The nation waited, gripped by both fear and fascination. Damien Cross was the kind of figure who didn't fit neatly into any narrative. Before his conviction, he was known as a brilliant architect, celebrated for his vision and meticulous attention to detail. Yet, there was something about him that unsettled those closest to him. A quiet intensity that hinted at buried secrets. His trial painted a damning portrait. A man consumed by jealousy and rage, accused of killing his wife, Laura. But to those who knew him well, Damien's guilt was never as certain as the headlines suggested. The case against Damien was built on circumstantial evidence. Neighbors whispered about arguments overheard, and prosecutors spun a compelling story of domestic discord turned deadly. Yet, beneath the surface, cracks began to show. Witness testimonies conflicted. Details didn't quite align. Even as the jury delivered a guilty verdict, whispers of doubt remained. Was Damien a calculated killer or a victim of a flawed system? The truth had never been fully uncovered. Damien's reemergence was as quiet as his escape was bold. No fanfare, no obvious trail. Those who encountered him described a man who radiated control and danger, his every movement deliberate. He didn't seem panicked, one witness later recounted. He looked at me, but it was like he wasn't seeing me, like he was already somewhere else. Theories about Damien's escape and intentions ran wild. Was he seeking revenge against those who testified against him? Hunting for answers about the night Laura died? Or was he simply trying to vanish into obscurity? Every lead seemed to deepen the mystery. Each move he made, or didn't make, left investigators guessing. The questions only grew louder, and the answers remained just out of reach. As the nation speculated, a darker truth began to emerge. Damien's past wasn't just marred by the crime he was accused of, but by the betrayals that had led him there. Relationships strained under the weight of secrets, and the truth about Laura's death was shrouded in layers of manipulation and lies. The people within Laura, and the people retreated by her. Those closest to him began to question their roles in his downfall. Could their choices have driven Damien to the breaking point? Or was he always destined to unravel? Damien's escape wasn't the end of his story. It was the beginning of something far more perilous. His motives remained cloaked, his every move calculated to stay ahead of the authorities. Those who thought they knew him would soon discover the depths of his resolve. What started as a prison break was quickly becoming a game of cat and mouse, one where the stakes weren't just Damien's freedom, but the lives and truths entangled in his past. Damien Cross had a life most would envy. His work as an architect was celebrated in glossy magazines, showcasing sprawling estates that seemed to leap straight from dreams. At company galas, he moved through the crowd like a polished gem, his charm effortlessly disarming even the most skeptical clients. By his side stood Laura, his wife of 8 years, with her disarming smile and quiet elegance, a couple seemingly destined for greatness. Behind closed doors, though, cracks began to form. Damien worked late nights, not from ambition but avoidance. Laura, once vibrant and full of life, had grown withdrawn, her laughter now a rare echo in their cavernous home. In an hour, "Is this what success looks like?" Damien muttered to himself one evening, staring out at the city skyline. He clutched a glass of bourbon, its sharp aroma masking a bitterness he couldn't quite name. Before going to bed, Tension had seeped into their home like a slow poison. Laura's once affectionate glances were replaced by wary observations. Damien's quick temper didn't help matters. "You're late again," Laura said one evening, her voice cool but trembling slightly. "You couldn't even text?" "No." "I was working," Damien snapped, throwing his keys onto the counter. "Not that you'd understand. Some of us still care about keeping this house running." The words stung more than he intended, but he didn't apologize. She turned away, and for a moment he considered softening his tone, but the gulf between them had grown too wide. Finances, once their strong suit, became another point of contention. Bills piled up, and Damien's high-priority projects weren't paying off as expected. Beneath their arguments lay deeper wounds, betrayals unspoken, desires unmet. "You know, I didn't sign up for this," Laura whispered one night. Her words lingered, heavy with implications neither dared to address. The morning Laura's body was found, the world seemed unnaturally still. The air inside their home carried an eerie silence, broken only by the wail of sirens. Enter the Sand Axe Murders. The scene was staged to perfection. Furniture overturned, drawers emptied, as though a burglar had fled in haste. Yet, something felt off. Laura lay motionless in their bedroom, her lifeless eyes open, her neck bruised as though by hands she once trusted. From the neighbors whispered. "I heard they were having problems," one woman said, clutching her robe, "but I never thought it would come to this." Section 10. Motivation and Purpose. Damien, dazed and seemingly broken, sat on the front steps as police questioned him. "She was my wife," he repeated, his voice raw. "Why would I hurt her?" The courtroom buzzed with an almost electric tension as the prosecution painted Damien as a man pushed to his breaking point. Jealousy, financial ruin, and a crumbling marriage, the prosecutor intoned, pacing the room. "This is not the story of a grieving husband. This is the story of a man who snapped." The defense struggled to counter the narrative. Damien's lawyer, a seasoned but weary man, argued, "This case is built on circumstantial evidence. No fingerprints, no witnesses, no motive beyond speculation." The jury, though, seemed captivated by the prosecutor's version. Laura's death became a symbol of shattered suburban dreams, and Damien its scapegoat. The guilty verdict came swiftly, leaving Damien staring blankly as his life unraveled. Despite the conviction, doubts lingered. A detective quietly noted inconsistencies in the timeline. A neighbor's testimony, once solid, began to waver. The staged nature of the crime scene nagged at some. Was Damien guilty, or had someone else orchestrated a perfect storm to frame him? Prison transformed Damien. The soft edges of a man once full of ambition eroded, replaced by sharp, unyielding corners. Days stretched into months, each filled with the same routine that dulled his senses but sharpened his resolve. "You'll get used to it," an older inmate said one day, noticing Damien's brooding silence. Damien only replied, "I'm not staying long enough to get used to it." Isolation bred anger, and anger fueled determination. In the quiet of his cell, Damien plodded, every detail etched into his mind like one of his architectural blueprints. Escape wasn't just a desire. It became his lifeline. "My day is well." The absence of freedom, companionship, and even basic human connection gnawed at Damien. Laura's face haunted him in the small hours of the night, her smile now a painful memory. "I couldn't save her," he whispered into the darkness, his voice trembling with guilt. Whether he mourned her loss or his failure to protect her remained unclear, even to him. As Damien reflected on Laura's death, pieces of a larger puzzle began to emerge. A cryptic comment from a fellow inmate hinted at deeper layers of betrayal. Laura's death wasn't an isolated act. It was part of something far more sinister. "Follow the money," the inmate said with a smirk, before walking away, leaving Damien to wonder who else might have wanted Laura dead. The world outside prison moved on, but Damien's name lingered like a stain on the community. Friends distanced themselves, neighbors exchanged knowing glances, and Laura's family, once close, disappeared entirely. He never got around to telling Damien that what Damien's conviction wasn't just a legal sentence. It was a societal excommunication, a reminder of how quickly people could turn. Damien Cross moved with precision. Each step of his escape had been meticulously planned, no detail too small to secure his freedom. From swapping identities to slipping through checkpoints unnoticed, he left no trace. His mind worked in overdrive, scanning every shadow and calculating every move. Hunched over a diner counter under dim fluorescent lights, Damien flipped through a crumpled newspaper. His photo stared back at him, accompanied by the words, "Convicted killer on the run." A waitress approached, her cheerful demeanor masking the tired lines around her eyes. "Hey, coffee?" she asked, setting the cup down before he could respond. "Please," he murmured, his voice low, his gaze fixed on an obituary buried in the corner of the page. A name jumped out, Victor Hale. Victor wasn't just a name, it was a clue. Someone connected to Laura's death. Someone who knew more than they let on. Damien folded the paper, slid a few bills onto the counter, and slipped into the night. The town he once called home felt unfamiliar, a distorted version of his memories. Damien parked his stolen car a block away from a modest brick house, its porch light casting a lonely glow. He knocked sharply, and the door creaked open. An older man with sunken eyes peered out, his face pale as recognition dawned. "Damien," the man stammered, his grip tightening on the door frame. "You shouldn't be here." "We need to talk, Greg," Damien said, his tone even but carrying an undercurrent of menace. "You were close to Laura. You know something." Greg hesitated, glancing over his shoulder as though the walls themselves could betray him. I already told the police everything." Victorio smiled. He had expected that. "No," Damien said, stepping closer. "You told them what they wanted to hear. Now, you'll tell me the truth." Greg's face flushed. "You think you can scare me? You're the one running, Damien. You're the one who—" "I didn't kill her," Damien snapped, his voice razor-sharp. "But I'll find out who did, and if you're hiding something, I'll make sure you regret it." Eleanor Carter had spent her career chasing answers, but this case was different. It was personal. Hired by Laura's family, she felt the weight of their grief pressing on her shoulders. The Cross case was more than an assignment. It was an obsession. Sitting in her office, surrounded by case files, Eleanor stared at a photo of Damien and Laura on their wedding day. Their smiles seemed genuine, but her gut told her there was more to their story. Her assistant poked his head in. A tip just came in. Someone matching Cross's description was seen near the Hale residence. Eleanor's eyes narrowed. "Victor Hale?" she asked, already reaching for her coat. "Yeah," he said. "Is that significant?" "It could be the key," Eleanor muttered, grabbing her keys. She couldn't shake the feeling that chasing Damien would uncover more than just a fugitive. It would expose truths no one was ready to face. Damien rifled through a dusty desk drawer in Victor Hale's abandoned office. Papers fluttered to the floor, revealing invoices, letters, and an envelope marked "Confidential." Inside was a photo of Laura, smiling in a way Damien hadn't seen in years. She was seated next to Victor, their hands brushing slightly, a gesture that spoke volumes. "Why were you meeting him, Laura?" Damien whispered, his throat tightening. The sound of footsteps snapped him out of his thoughts. He turned, heart pounding, but the office was empty. Someone had been here recently, and he was no longer alone in his search for answers. As Damien pieced together the contents of Victor's files, a chilling picture began to form. Laura's death wasn't an isolated incident. It was tied to financial dealings, a secret affair, and a network of lies. Victor had manipulated her, pulling her into a dangerous game of power and greed. Damien's mind reeled as he realized the extent of the betrayal. "She didn't deserve this," he said to himself, clenching a photograph in his hand. None of it. But the deeper he dug, the clearer it became. Laura had kept secrets from him, too. Trust, once unshakable, was now an elusive ghost. Eleanor tracked Damien's movements with relentless focus. Each step brought her closer, but with every discovery, her certainty about his guilt wavered. The files she uncovered suggested Laura's life had been far more complicated than anyone had imagined. Sitting in her car outside a motel where Damien had been spotted, Eleanor dialed her contact at the precinct. "I need backup," she said, her voice steady, "but tell them to hold back until I give the word." As she waited, her thoughts swirled. Was she chasing a murderer or a man seeking justice for the woman he'd loved? Damien's interactions with those tied to Laura's death became a delicate balance of intimidation and persuasion. He approached an old colleague of Victor's, his tone calm, but his words razor-sharp. Victor picked his times and responded. "You knew Victor was involved in something illegal," Damien said, his gaze unwavering, "and you let Laura get caught in the middle." The man fumbled for an excuse, but Damien leaned in, his voice lowering. "If you don't tell me everything, I'll make sure you wish you had." Each conversation chipped away at the facade of those who had wronged Laura, leaving Damien with a growing list of enemies and a narrowing path to the truth. Damien's quest took a darker turn as his frustration boiled over. Confronting another suspect, his voice trembled with rage. "You used her. You lied to her, and now she's dead because of you." "I didn't pull the trigger," the man shouted, fear etched across his face. "No," Damien said coldly, "but you might as well have." As the confrontation escalated, Damien felt the weight of his choices pressing down on him. Was he truly seeking justice, or had he crossed a line he could never return from? Damien's and Eleanor's paths finally converged at an abandoned warehouse, the site of Victor Hale's last meeting with Laura. The air was thick with tension as Damien sifted through evidence, his every move shadowed by Eleanor. "Hastile le mosque." "Stop," her voice rang out, firm yet uncertain. Lemos nodded and smiled. Presently the lamp in her hand turned slightly blue. Though she closed her eyes, she concentrated as best she could on the messages hooked. Damien turned slowly, his face a mixture of anger and anguish. "You don't understand. She was betrayed by everyone she trusted." "And you think this will bring her back?" Eleanor asked, stepping closer. "Or is this just about your revenge?" Damien's jaw tightened. "Sometimes they're the same thing." The old warehouse loomed in the darkness, its rusted beams creaking under the weight of the wind. Damien's footsteps echoed against the cracked concrete floor as he approached the center of the room. Waiting for him, seated at a wooden table that seemed out of place in the cavernous space, was Victor Hale, his face half hidden in shadow. "I knew you'd find me," Victor said, his voice calm but tinged with arrogance. "I wasn't sure you'd have the guts to show up," Damien replied, his tone sharp enough to cut through the tension. Victor leaned back, folding his hands. "Ah, you've caused quite the spectacle, Damien. escaping prison, digging into my affairs. But I have to ask, what now? Damien's jaw tightened. Now, you tell me why my wife is dead. Victor chuckled dryly, a sound that only fanned the flames of Damien's fury. Laura made her choices, he said. You made yours. The truth won't change that. You're lying, Damien hissed, slamming his fist on the table. Laura wasn't part of your games. She wouldn't betray me. Victor's smirk faded, replaced by something colder. You think you knew her? You were so consumed by your work, your ambition, you didn't even see it happening. Damien's mind raced as Victor pushed a folder across the table. Inside were emails, photos, and financial records. Each piece painted a picture Damien couldn't reconcile with the woman he loved. Laura had been working with Victor, siphoning funds from one of Damien's projects to cover mounting debts. She was desperate, Victor said, his tone almost sympathetic. And when she realized I wouldn't cover for her anymore, well, she tried to get out. But by then, it was too late. Damien's grip on the folder tightened. Betrayal, guilt, and grief collided, threatening to drown him. She trusted you, Damien growled, his voice trembling with rage. You used her and then let her die. Victor stood, his calm demeanor replaced with a defensive edge. She made her own choices, Damien. You think this is all my fault? She was in over her head and you weren't there to pull her out. Damien stepped forward, his fists clenched. You're a coward, hiding behind excuses while you destroy lives. Victor's eyes narrowed. You're no saint. You've torn through everyone connected to this, acting like some avenging angel. But let me ask you, how many lives will you ruin before you admit you're just as guilty? The words hit Damien like a hammer. The line between justice and vengeance blurred further with every breath. Before Damien could respond, the warehouse door creaked open. Eleanor Carter entered, her presence commanding despite the chaos unfolding. Her gun was drawn but aimed at the floor, her expression a mixture of resolve and empathy. Damien, stop, she said firmly, her gaze locked on him. This isn't the way. Deeper. Stay out of this, Damien snapped, his voice raw. He killed her. Eleanor shook her head. He didn't pull the trigger, Damien. And you don't have to either. You think this will bring you peace? It won't. You'll lose what's left of yourself. Victor seized the moment. Listen to her, Damien. You've already thrown your life away once. Don't do it again. Damien turned toward Eleanor, his face a storm of emotion. You don't understand what he's done. I understand more than you think, Eleanor replied softly. But justice doesn't come from revenge. It comes from truth. Damien's grip on the gun wavered as Victor's smirk returned. See? You can't do it. You're not a killer. The words ignited something within Damien. I wasn't. But maybe I should have been, he muttered, stepping closer. Eleanor took a cautious step forward. Damien, please. If you do this, you'll lose everything. Your freedom, your humanity. Think about Laura. What would she want? The mention of Laura's name stopped Damien in his tracks. Images of her smile, her laugh, the way she used to hold his hand, flooded his mind. His arm dropped, the gun clattering to the floor. Victor exhaled in relief, but Damien's glare made it clear this wasn't over. Eleanor took the opportunity to step between the two men. We end this now, she said, her voice steady. No more lies, no more games. And clues lead nowhere out desert. She pulled out a recording device and set it on the table. Tell the truth, Victor. Everything. Or I'll make sure the world sees what's in this folder. Victor's bravado cracked. You wouldn't dare. Try me, Eleanor said coldly. Faced with no other option, Victor began to talk. The web of deceit unraveled further. Laura's involvement, the threats Victor had made, and the people he had manipulated to cover his tracks. The truth spilled out, leaving both Damien and Eleanor reeling. With Victor's confession recorded, Eleanor turned to Damien. "It's over. You don't have to carry this anymore." But Damien's hands still trembled. "He destroyed her," he whispered, tears streaming down his face. "And I let it happen." "You didn't let anything happen," Eleanor said gently. "She made her choices, and so did he. Now it's time for you to make yours." Damien's eyes met hers, and for the first time in years, he felt the weight of his grief lift slightly. He nodded, stepping back as Eleanor secured Victor. As the police arrived, Victor was taken into custody, his crimes laid bare. Eleanor watched Damien as he sat on the steps of the warehouse, the cold night air wrapping around him. "Watch now?" he asked quietly. "That's up to you," Eleanor replied. "You've lost so much, but you're still here. Don't waste it." For a moment they sat in silence, the distant sound of sirens fading into the night. Damien's journey wasn't over, but for the first time, it felt like it might lead somewhere worth going. The warehouse buzzed with the chaos of flashing sirens and hurried footsteps. Police officers swarmed the scene, their radios crackling as they relayed updates. Victor Hale, his face pale and drained of defiance, was led to a patrol car in handcuffs. His confession, captured by Eleanor, had sealed his fate. Damien sat on the warehouse steps, his head in his hands. The adrenaline that had fueled his every move drained away, leaving only exhaustion. He could hear fragments of conversations around him. "He's the one who escaped," a young officer whispered to another. "An exposed Hale," his partner replied. "Doesn't make him innocent, though." Damien's mind reeled. He had set out to find justice for Laura, but the cost had been higher than he anticipated. The world seemed too loud, too fast, and he felt impossibly small within it. The ride back to the station was silent. Damien stared out of the window, watching the city blur past. Every memory of Laura felt sharper now. Her laughter, the way she used to tease him about his meticulous habits, and the pain in her eyes during their last argument. "I should have been there," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I should have known." Regret weighed heavily on him. He had chased revenge so fiercely that it had consumed him. His hands trembled as he clenched them into fists, trying to find an anchor. In the quiet of his mind, Laura's voice echoed, a bittersweet comfort and a painful reminder. Eleanor watched Damien from across the precinct, her own thoughts tangled. She felt relief knowing Victor Hale would finally face justice, but it was laced with unease. The lines between right and wrong had blurred too much during this case. His flat voice added enough tension to the situation to... Was it worth it? She asked herself, her reflection staring back from a window pane. At this hour, of this night, a colleague approached, handing her a coffee. "You did good, Eleanor. Hale's confession will close a lot of wounds." "Will it, though?" she replied, her voice softer than usual. "Damien lost everything. Laura's gone. And I don't even know what justice looks like anymore." The sun lowered in the sky and the glass rustled and rippled in its place. The storm... Her colleague hesitated before walking away, leaving her with her thoughts. Eleanor had always been strong, driven by a clear moral compass. But now, the scars from this case ran deep, and she wasn't sure if she could ever look at justice the same way again. News of Victor's crimes and Damien's escape spread like wildfire. Headlines alternated between "Victor Hale exposed as mastermind behind Laura Cross's death" and escaped convict Damien Cross, a hero or a vigilante. Sometimes the headlines were spontaneous, unrelated, and rolled simultaneously. Televised debates raged. Damien broke the law, one commentator argued. He endangered lives. Yet he revealed the truth, another countered. He did what the system failed to do. Public opinion remained divided. Some hailed Damien as a tragic figure, a man pushed to extremes by grief and betrayal. Others saw him as reckless, someone who let anger dictate his actions. In the court of public opinion, there was no clear verdict. As the days turned to weeks, Damien's case remained unresolved. His escape had brought justice to light, but the means he had used left an unsettling aftertaste. Eleanor, sitting in her now cluttered office, read over the final case report. She couldn't stop thinking about Damien's last words to her. "I didn't want this," he had said, his voice heavy with resignation. "I just wanted her back." She sighed, closing the file. Was Damien a hero who exposed corruption, or a man broken by grief, unable to see beyond his own pain? The truth, she realized, was somewhere in between. Justice, it seemed, was as complicated as the people seeking it. Months later, the dust had mostly settled, but the scars remained. Eleanor walked through a park, the crisp air biting at her cheeks. She spotted Damien sitting on a bench, his posture relaxed, but his expression distant. They hadn't spoken since the case closed. "You're not supposed to be here," she said, sitting beside him. "I'm a free man now," Damien replied, a faint smile playing on his lips. "Well, as free as someone like me can be." They sat in silence for a moment, before Eleanor spoke again. "Do you ever wonder if this is what Laura would have wanted?" Damien exhaled deeply. "Every day. And I still don't know the answer." The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the park. The scars of their past would never fully heal, but, for the first time, there was a glimmer of something new. Hope. Unable to say the words, he flung his arms around Sarah and said. The night air was heavy with unspoken words as Damien stood at the edge of the pier, staring out over the water. His reflection in the murky depths was a fractured version of the man he once knew. He had been betrayed by the one person he trusted most, Laura, and that trust had torn him apart. The pain lingered, a constant reminder that some wounds would never heal. It was the reason he gave up the road and fled to America, and that trust had torn him apart. The pain lingered, a constant reminder that some wounds would never heal. Eleanor, standing beside him, watched quietly, the weight of the past settling between them. The two of them had been through so much that neither of them could ever forget. The betrayals, the secrets, the lies. None of it had been easy to carry. Damien's voice was barely a whisper, hoarse with the years of unresolved emotions. "I should have known. She was everything to me, and I didn't see it until it was too late." Eleanor's hand brushed his lightly, offering an unspoken comfort. But she knew the truth. Some scars didn't fade, no matter how much time passed. For weeks, Eleanor had replayed the events in her mind. She had done what she thought was right. She had pursued justice for Laura, for the truth. Yet, every time she closed her eyes, the image of Damien's face, torn between justice and vengeance, haunted her. As she walked through the empty streets that evening, the sound of her footsteps echoing in the quiet, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had pushed Damien too far. Had she really helped him find peace? Or had she just fed his need for revenge, turning him into someone he hadn't been before? "I didn't know the cost would be this high," she murmured to herself, her breath coming in shallow bursts. The weight of her choices pressed down on her chest. Could she live with what she had done? Yes. It was time to let the spirit of her dead rest. Standing up, she glanced around the dimly lit room. She ran her fingers over the white stone of the wall. She closed her eyes. I wish I could return. Damien stood at the door of his apartment, his hand resting on the knob, but he couldn't bring himself to turn it. The image of Victor Hale, standing there like a predator caught in his own lies, was burned into his mind. Had he done the right thing? Or had he crossed a line he could never come back from? He had exposed Victor's crimes, yes, but what had it cost him? His humanity? His soul? You did what had to be done, Eleanor had told him once. But now, as Damien stood alone in the dim light, he wasn't so sure. Had he truly done it for justice? Or had he simply become the thing he had once despised, the thing that had destroyed him? Damien closed his eyes, his mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. He wasn't sure anymore. The line between right and wrong had blurred, and with it his understanding of what justice truly was. Eleanor sat by her desk, a cup of cold coffee in front of her. The case was closed, but the questions lingered. The truth had come to light, but at what cost? Was justice truly served, or had it merely fed into the cycle of pain and retribution? She picked up the file on Laura's case and stared at the photo of her, the woman who had once been full of life, but had been crushed under the weight of the world's expectations. What was justice, really? Was it about truth, or was it about revenge? Eleanor let the file fall to the floor with a soft thud, feeling the weight of it settle on her heart. The story was finished, but she knew the question would linger. Could anyone ever truly find redemption? Or were they all just prisoners of their own choices?